There are haunted houses scattered across America, places where doors slam on their own, where cold spots appear for no reason, where shadows move in corners. Most of these stories fade with time. They become local legends, whispered over campfires, half remembered by the next generation. But there is one haunting that refused to fade. One case so well documented, so thoroughly witnessed, that it stands alone in American history as the only time a death has been officially attributed to a supernatural entity. This is the story of the Bell Witch, a tale of terror that began on a quiet Tennessee farm in 1817 and has never truly ended. The year was 1804 when John Bell made a decision that would change everything. He was a successful farmer in North Carolina, a man of means with a growing family. 9 children called him father, and his wife Lucy stood beside him as they'd built their fortune together. But John Bell wanted more. He wanted land, vast stretches of it, in a place where opportunity still whispered promises to those brave enough to claim it. So the Bell family packed everything they owned and crossed the treacherous mountains into Tennessee, settling in what is now Robertson County, near a small community that would one day be called Adams. John purchased land along the Red River, 300 acres that would eventually grow to nearly 400. He cleared the fields himself, planted corn and tobacco, and built a home for his family. The Bells prospered. John became an elder at the Red River Baptist Church, a pillar of the community, respected by his neighbors. For 13 years, life was good. Then came the summer of 1817. John Bell was walking through his cornfields, inspecting the crops as he did every morning. That's when he saw it. Sitting motionless among the rows of corn was a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. It had the body of a large dog, powerfully built with thick fur. But where a dog's head should have been, there was something else entirely. The head of a rabbit. Long ears, a flat nose, eyes that stared at him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. John Bell raised his musket, aimed at the impossible thing crouching in his field, and fired. The shot echoed across the farm, and when the smoke cleared, the creature was gone. Not dead, not wounded, simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all. John Bell told himself it was nothing. A trick of the morning light, perhaps. He went back to his work and tried to forget what he'd seen, but the farm remembered. A few days later, the knocking started. It began at night, always at night, when the family had gone to bed and the house should have been silent. Soft at first, barely audible. Tap, tap, tap. On the walls, on the doors, on the windows. John and Lucy would lie awake in the darkness, listening, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. An animal maybe, or the wind, but animals don't knock with rhythm, and the wind doesn't move from room to room with purpose. The sounds grew louder. What had started as gentle tapping became violent pounding. The walls shook, the windows rattled in their frames. And then came new sounds. Scratching, like claws dragging down wood. Creaking footsteps in empty hallways. The flapping of wings against the ceiling, though no bird could have gotten inside. The Bell children began waking in terror, crying that something was pulling at their bed covers, yanking them off in the middle of the night. They reported hearing sounds like gnawing, as if something with teeth was chewing on the posts of their beds. And then the violence began. It started with Betsy. Elizabeth Bell, the Bells' youngest daughter, was around 12 years old when she became the primary target of whatever had invaded their home. She would wake screaming, her face marked with red welts and bruises that appeared as she slept. Handprints, finger marks, as if invisible hands had slapped and pinched her throughout the night. The family was terrified, but John Bell was a proud man, a respected elder of the church. For months he told no one outside the family what was happening. But eventually the secret became too heavy to carry alone. John Bell confided in his closest friend, a man named James Johnston. He told him everything: the creature in the cornfield, the knocking, the attacks on Betsy. James Johnston listened, and then he made a decision. He and his wife would spend the night in the Bell home. They would see for themselves if these stories were true. That night, James and his wife lay awake in the guest room, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then it started. scratching at the walls so close it sounded like it was right beside their bed. Footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate, and then something grabbed the covers and yanked them violently off the bed. James Johnston leapt up, fumbling for a candle, but there was nothing to see. Just darkness, and the sound of something that might have been laughter, drifting through the empty room. The next morning, James Johnston was pale. He told John Bell that he believed him. Every word. And he told him something else. This was bigger than the Bell family now. This needed to be known. Word spread through Robertson County like wildfire. The Bell farm was haunted by something that defied explanation. Neighbors came to investigate. Some stayed the night and fled before morning. Others witnessed the phenomena themselves. Objects moving on their own. Violent knocking that had no source. And always, the attacks on young Betsy Bell. Then, in late 1817, the entity found its voice. It started as a faint whisper that the family could barely hear. Then it grew stronger, louder, clearer, until finally the voice could be heard by anyone in the house, speaking with perfect clarity. And what it said changed everything. The voice quoted scripture, long passages from the Bible delivered in the cadence of a preacher. It sang hymns, sometimes beautifully, sometimes in a mocking, twisted tone that made the holy words sound profane. And then it began calling the family members by name. It knew them. Not just their names, but details about their lives, their secrets, their fears. It would answer questions about events that had happened years ago, revealing information that only the Bell family could know. This wasn't a mindless haunting. This was an intelligence, and it had an agenda. The voice reserved its greatest hatred for John Bell. It would hurl insults at him, calling him names that turned the air foul. It promised him suffering. It vowed in a voice that was sometimes that of an old woman and sometimes something far less human, that it would kill him. Betsy, meanwhile, faced a different kind of torment. The voice began interfering in her life, specifically in her courtship with a local young man named Joshua Gardner. Betsy and Joshua had been planning to marry, but the voice was relentless. It would whisper threats in Betsy's ear. It told her over and over that if she married Joshua Gardner, something terrible would happen. Eventually, heartbroken and terrified, Betsy broke off the engagement. The voice seemed pleased. Some in the community began referring to the entity as Kate, after a local woman named Kate Batts, who'd had a bitter dispute with John Bell years earlier. What is known is that by 1818, the haunting had become so severe that John Bell was excommunicated from his church. The official reason was a business dispute, a charge of usury. But many believe the real reason was the supernatural chaos that followed the Bell family wherever they went. News of the Bell Witch traveled far beyond Robertson County. In 1819, General Andrew Jackson himself, the war hero who would one day become president, came to visit the Bell farm. 3 of John Bell's sons had served under Jackson during the Battle of New Orleans, and Jackson had heard the wild stories about their family. He arrived with a wagon full of men, ready to spend the night and witness the phenomena for themselves. According to legend, as Jackson's wagon approached the Bell property, it suddenly stopped. The wheels locked. The horses strained and pulled, but the wagon wouldn't budge. Jackson and his men climbed down to inspect the wheels, but they found nothing wrong. Then, from somewhere in the trees, a voice rang out. It was a woman's voice, cackling with laughter, and it said, "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you tonight." The wagon immediately lurched forward. Jackson turned to his men and said, "By the eternal, boys, this is worse than fighting the British." That night, Jackson and his men waited in the Bell home. What is known is that Jackson left the next morning, pale and shaken, and he was heard to say that he would rather fight the British again than spend another night at the Bell farm. Meanwhile, John Bell's health was failing. In 1817, he began experiencing episodes of facial paralysis. His tongue would swell, and he found it increasingly difficult to swallow. Mysterious seizures would leave him unconscious for hours. Doctors were called, but nothing worked. John Bell was wasting away, and no one could tell him why. The voice grew gleeful. It took credit for his illness. It taunted him as he grew weaker, and it promised that his suffering would end only when he was dead. By December of 1820, John Bell could no longer get out of bed. On the morning of December 19th, Lucy Bell found him unconscious, barely breathing. Someone noticed a small vial on the medicine cabinet, filled with a dark, oily liquid that no one recognized. Suspicious, John Bell's son and a neighbor decided to test it. They placed a single drop of the liquid on a straw and fed it to the family cat. The cat convulsed violently and died within seconds. They threw the vial into the fireplace. It exploded in a bright blue flame, a color that modern chemists would later identify as characteristic of burning arsenic. John Bell died that same day. He was 70 years old, and as his body lay cooling in the room, the voice of the Bell Witch filled the house. It sang, loud, raucous drinking songs that echoed through the halls. It laughed. It crowed with triumph. "I fixed him," it said. "I did it, and he will not get up." The funeral was held on the Bell farm, and as the mourners filed past the grave, the voice sang again, mocking hymns and crude ballads, until the last person had left the cemetery. John Bell became the first and only person in American history whose death was officially attributed to a supernatural entity. After John Bell's death, the activity at the farm began to quiet. The violent attacks stopped. The voice grew fainter, and then, in 1821, it spoke one final time to Lucy Bell. It told her that it was leaving, but it would return. In 7 years, it promised, it would come back. True to its word, in 1828, the voice returned. It appeared to John Bell Jr. and engaged him in conversations about politics, religion, and the future. It predicted the Civil War decades before it would happen. Then it promised to return again, in 1935, to haunt a descendant of the Bell family. But when 1935 came, there were no reports of any major haunting. The Bell Witch, it seemed, had finally left the Bell family in peace. But before you think this story has a neat ending, I need to tell you something. The Bell farm still exists. The land is still there, along with the Bell Witch Cave, a dark opening in the earth that was part of John Bell's original property. And people still report strange things happening there. Visitors to the cave describe hearing unexplained footsteps, whispers in the darkness, and the sound of something tapping on the stone walls. Photographers have reported difficulty taking pictures at the site. Cameras malfunction, batteries drain inexplicably, and sometimes the images that do come out show strange lights or shadows that weren't visible to the naked eye. The cave was added to the National Historical Registry in 2008, the only original feature from the Bell Witch legend that remains largely unchanged from how the Bell family would have seen it in 1817. The knocking, the voices, the physical attacks witnessed by dozens of people. We bring you the most documented, the most compelling, the most terrifying paranormal encounters from across history. Click that subscribe button because there are so many more stories waiting in the dark. So what do we make of the Bell Witch? Over 200 years later, researchers and skeptics still debate what really happened on that Tennessee farm. Some point to the possibility of arsenic poisoning. Dr. Megan Mann, a chemistry professor at Austin Peay State University, has noted that John Bell's symptoms, the facial paralysis, the difficulty swallowing, the neurological distress, are consistent with chronic arsenic exposure. The bright blue flame when the mysterious vial was burned is a telltale sign of arsenic. And arsenic was widely available at the time, commonly used as rat poison. Others have suggested that the haunting was an elaborate hoax, perhaps staged by someone in the community with a grudge against John Bell. But if it was a hoax, it was one that fooled experienced investigators, church elders, and even General Andrew Jackson. It would have required a level of coordination and theatrical skill that seems impossible for a rural farming community in the early 19th century. Then there are those who believe the simplest explanation. That something supernatural, something that defies our understanding of the natural world, truly did terrorize the Bell family for 4 long years. That the entity called Kate was real, and that it killed John Bell out of pure malice. It became the definitive account of the Bell Witch, and it remains the primary source for researchers to this day. In the 1890s, Ingram came into possession of a manuscript written by Richard Williams Bell, John Bell's youngest son. Richard had been only 6 years old when the haunting began, but he'd recorded his memories and the stories told to him by his older siblings. Ingram interviewed other people who had known the Bell family, collecting eyewitness accounts from those who'd experienced the haunting firsthand. Then, in 1894, he published a book, an authenticated history of the famous Bell Witch. The book should have been a straightforward publication. But according to Ingram, the printing press itself became the site of supernatural activity. Workers reported hearing strange singing, maniacal laughter, prayers, and moaning. Objects rattled and something seemed to move across the roof. That the voices we hear in the night might not be our imagination. But at the heart of all these retellings is the original story. A family, living on a quiet farm in Tennessee, who encountered something that should not exist. Something that could speak, that could attack, that could kill. And something that, according to some, may still be there, waiting in the darkness of the Bell Witch Cave. Some stories are meant to entertain, others are meant to warn, and a few, like the story of the Bell Witch, exist to remind us that there are things in this world we will never fully understand. That the darkness holds more than shadows, still waiting, still watching, still whispering in the darkness. But ask the locals about the Bell Witch, and you'll see their expressions change. Some will tell you it's just a legend, a story passed down through generations. Others will tell you about their own experiences, the strange things they've seen near the old Bell property, the sounds they've heard echoing from the cave, the feeling late at night that something is watching from the tree line. Because some hauntings, the truly powerful ones, don't have an expiration date. They settle into the land itself, becoming part of the soil, the stone, the air,